Today, Intelligent Systems is best known for developing popular series like Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and WarioWare. But before they were making games, they mainly worked with Nintendo and their partners on hardware and system tools. Today, developers have easy access to game engines like Unreal and Unity, but back in the NES days, such tools were not as widely available. In an episode of Iwata Asks, Super Smash Bros. Series director Masahiro Sakurai recounts his early days at HAL Laboratory, saying, "When I first joined HAL Laboratory, there were development tools for the NES, and all of them were labeled with the Intelligent Systems logo. Other companies developing NES software were also using development tools from Intelligent Systems. The studio also helped develop NES titles like Duck Hunt, Hogan's Alley, and Gyromite." After assisting with a number of ports, Intelligent Systems started shifting their studio's direction to become more software-focused, and began work on a war simulation game that would set the foundation for games to come. Famicom Wars was released in Japan on August 12, 1988 for the Nintendo Famicom. The player would take control of one of two factions, Red Star or Blue Moon. The overall objective was to completely wipe out the opposing faction over the course of 15 maps. 2 secret maps were also available depending on which faction the player chose. The player would claim victory over a map either when the entire opposing force was defeated or their headquarters was captured. Each faction took turns moving their troops, taking over buildings, attacking opposing troops, and building additional units. The player was given a set amount of money they could use to build additional units, and could gain more money with each new building they captured. There were 16 different unit types in total, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Tanks, for example, were strong in combat and could transport troops, but couldn't capture buildings. Foot soldiers, on the other hand, were weak against tanks, but could capture cities and buildings. By today's standards, the gameplay might seem rudimentary, but for the time it was quite deep and innovative. Famicom's Sunshin magazine, now known as Famitsu, gave Famicom Wars a score of 33 out of 40 and declared it one of the best games of all time in its 1989 All-Soft catalog issue. The game was considered a success and would spawn several sequels, including the first entry to release in the West, Advance Wars. After the release of Famicom Wars, Intelligent Systems wanted to create another simulation game, but move away from the war-based setting. This next title would combine the strategic gameplay of Famicom Wars with the story and characters of an RPG. Initially, the game exceeded the memory limitations of a Famicom cartridge, but after reallocating space typically meant for saving, the team was able to get it running. There was also a special chip loaded onto the cartridge that would allow it to display Japanese text. Little did Intelligent Systems know that their next game, never originally meant to be a commercial release, would go on to become the biggest franchise in the company's history. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was released in Japan on April 20th, 1990 for the Nintendo Famicom. The original concept was created by Shozo Kaga, who also served as a scenario writer and designer. Keisuke Terasaki helmed the project as director, with longtime Nintendo veteran Gunpei Yokoi serving as producer, and Yuka Tsujioko penning the musical score. The story followed the adventures of Marth, Prince of Altea, and his journey to reclaim his throne. At a young age, Marth's family was killed and he was forced to flee to the neighboring island nation of Talos. Several years later, Marth proved his worth in battle by staving off a group of invading pirates. He then set off on a journey to liberate the world from the same group that killed his family, joined by a small band of soldiers and the princess of Talos, Sita. Along the way, Marth is given the titular Fire Emblem, a legendary shield meant to be given to the one destined to save the world. After Marth used it to free his home of Altea, he learns that his sister Elise is still alive and being held captive by an evil wizard named Garnith. Garnith had resurrected the ancient shadow dragon Medeus, with plans to conquer the world. After obtaining the powerful Starlight Tome and reclaiming his father's sword Falchion, Marth defeats the evil fiends, rescues his sister Elise, and restores peace to the land once again. If the player managed to keep Sita alive to the end of the game, an extra scene played out where Marth and her would confess their love for each other. Through the course of the game, the player also encounters the divine dragon Tiki, who could take the form of a young girl. Tiki would return in several sequels and is one of the most widely recognized characters in the franchise. Gameplay was similar in many ways to Famicom Wars. The game was broken up into a series of grid-based maps that the player would battle through in a turn-based fashion. The player would claim victory in a variety of ways, mainly through defeating certain boss characters. Unlike Famicom Wars though, there was no money to spend on training troops each turn. Every troop was deployed at the beginning of each battle, and it was all about the combat. There were 25 total characters to recruit and 21 different character classes available through the game. One mechanic that would become a staple of the franchise was permadeath. If a character fell in battle, they could not be revived and were gone for the rest of the game. If Marth died, it was game over. This created an increased sense of tension as players didn't want to lose their favorite characters. Permadeath certainly made for a challenging but also highly rewarding experience. Through the course of battles, characters could earn experience points and upgrade their gear throughout the game. Once a character earned enough XP, they would level up and their stats would increase. There were also shops and vendors throughout the world that would sell better gear for your troops. At launch, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was not well received and did not sell particularly well. Japanese outlets gave the game low scores due to its poor graphics and steep learning curve. Players, however, did not share the same opinion. Sales flattened after around 2 months, but after a glowing Famitsu column and word of mouth amongst players spread, sales picked back up. As of 2002, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light has sold nearly 330,000 copies and got re-released on Nintendo's Virtual Console for Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. The Famicom version was never released outside of Japan. However, the game did receive 3 remakes, the latter of which finally did see a worldwide release. For Intelligent Systems, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was just their next game, but for other Japanese game developers, it was an inspiration. As a series, Fire Emblem is credited with not only popularizing the strategy RPG genre, but also for inspiring other franchises like Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Disgaea. Following the commercial success of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, development of a sequel began aiming to address some of the game's criticisms. The game was given the subtitle of Gaiden, which in Japanese refers to a side story. This was appropriate as this next game was highly experimental, with many of the new gameplay systems introduced not returning for future sequels. Fire Emblem Gaiden was released in Japan for the Nintendo Famicom on March 14, 1992. Shozo Kaga was elevated to director for the project, as well as assuming his designing and writing roles. Gunpei Yokoi returned as a producer along with Yuka Tsujioko to write the music. The story takes place on the continent of Valentia, where 2 nations, Zofia and Rigel, are torn apart by their respective gods, Milla and Duma. Fire Emblem Gaiden was a dual protagonist story, following childhood friends Alm and Celica. After being separated at a young age, many years go by and they each set out on their own journey, which cross paths throughout the game. Alm looks to push out Rigel's invading army, led by Emperor Rudolph, while Celica is in search of the goddess Milla, who's gone missing. Near the end of the game, Alm finally confronts and defeats Emperor Rudolph in battle. In his final words, Rudolph shares with Alm that his birth name is actually Albin Alm Rudolph, and that he is the Emperor's son. It's also revealed through the story that Celica's real name is Anthis, and the Princess of Zofia, making the 2 protagonists the royal heirs to their respective countries. All story points converge at Duma Temple, where Alm and Celica reunite to defeat Duma, causing Duma and Milla to leave the world forever. In the end, Alm and Celica get married and unite their nations under one rule for all of Valentia. Despite Gaiden having 2 protagonists, Alm and Celica's armies did not fight together, but instead would fight separately with their own paths through the story. The player could navigate the world with each army, not just through different battles, but also dungeons and towns. At towns, players could explore, recruit new characters, buy new equipment, and even swap items between armies through a special vendor. A few other additions were added to Gaiden on top of exploration. Character classes were not set in stone, but could be upgraded to more powerful ones once the character reached a certain level. Alm, for example, could graduate from the fighter class to the hero class. Spells would also consume a portion of the caster's health, adding yet another layer of strategy. As time has passed, Fire Emblem Gaiden is looked back on as the black sheep of the series, with many comparing it to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link and Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest due to its experimental nature. It was, however, fairly well received, with Famitsu giving the game a score of 28 out of 40, and as of 2002 had sold just shy of 325,000 copies. It also released on Nintendo's Virtual Console in Japan for the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. Gaiden would also get its own remake decades later on the 3DS. Fire Emblem had established itself as a strong franchise for Nintendo, but Kaga wasn't satisfied. The first 2 games both took place on the continent of Arcanea, and Kaga wanted to expand the story beyond that constraint. For the next game in the series, he wanted to tell a more grand-scale story spanning across generations. His ambition, among other hardships, made for a more prolonged and rocky development. For starters, there was a staff change which took time for new members to catch up. A large number of staff members also moved offices, further delaying the project. The gameplay elements had changed so many times through development that at one point it wasn't even going to be a Fire Emblem game. Toru Narahiro, one of the game's staff members, estimated that the game was probably remade 2 or 3 times from the prototype stage to the final release. Originally announced as Inheritors of Light, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War was easily one of the most innovative titles in the series. Many of its new game systems like Romance, a Home Base, and the Weapon Triangle would go on to become franchise staples for years to come. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War was released in Japan for the Nintendo Super Famicom on May 14, 1996. Kaga, Yokoi, and Tsuchiyoko all returned to their respective roles, although this would be the last Fire Emblem game that Gunpei Yokoi would serve as producer. Genealogy of the Holy War took place on the continent of Jugdrill, made up of 8 countries, which were founded by the 12 Crusaders. These 12 Crusaders defeated Loptir, an ancient dragon who ruled over the world. Genealogy of the Holy War picks up over 100 years later and tells the story of Sigurd and Selef, a father and son trying to stop a group from resurrecting Loptir. The story was a grand one, not told over the course of a few months or years, but over decades. Genealogy of the Holy War included several provocative story elements like the death of a protagonist, possession, and incest. In the first act of the game, Sigurd falls in love with and marries Deirdre, a descendant of one of the 12 Crusaders powerful enough to defeat Loptir. Together, they have a son, Selef. The Loptir sect kidnaps Deirdre with the intention of using her to help revive Loptir. They have her memories erased and plan to have her marry Lord Arvis, her half-brother. The goal was for Arvis and Deirdre to have a child powerful enough to serve as a host for the resurrected Loptir. As Sigurd fights his way to rescue Deirdre, he learns that Arvis has married her, making him King of Granvale. Arvis then has all of Sigurd's troops executed and killed Sigurd himself. The Yide Massacre was one of the most shocking plot twists in a video game at the time and still looms over the series today. Act 2 picks up many years later, with Deirdre having given birth to twins, Julius and Julia. Julius would serve as the vessel for Loptir, eventually overthrowing his father. Deirdre would later sacrifice herself to teleport Julia away to safety. Selef would eventually emerge from hiding, and along with the help of Julia, team up with the children of his father's companions to overthrow Julius's tyrannical regime. The turn-based tactical combat and victory conditions followed series tradition, but this time you had a home base to come back to. You could enter bases before and during missions to perform tasks like repairing weapons and buying items. One of the biggest innovations for Genealogy of the Holy War was the Weapon Triangle. The Weapon Triangle was inspired by rock, paper, scissors, where certain weapons were strong and weak to each other. In this case, lances beat swords, swords beat axes, and axes beat lances. A similar system was also added for magic. The Weapon Triangle added an extra layer of strategy as the player had to be mindful not to leave their troops in vulnerable spots on the map. Another huge mechanic was the romance system. Dialogue sequences would trigger on maps or through story moments that had characters fall in love and eventually have children. Characters that were in relationships benefited from fighting together as they gave each other stat boosts during combat. What was neat is that the way these romances played out had a direct impact on stats and abilities for their children in the second act of the game. There was another similar system called Leadership Rank, where certain high-level units could give stat boosts to nearby troops. Intelligence Systems had another hit on their hands, with Genealogy of the Holy War selling nearly 500,000 copies. The game was praised for its epic story and customization, with many considering it one of the best entries in the series. It eventually released for Nintendo's Virtual Console on Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, but is still not seen in official release outside of Japan. Only a month after the release of Genealogy of the Holy War, Nintendo launched their next home console, the Nintendo 64. It touted breathtaking 3D visuals for the time, and launched with the classic platformer Super Mario 64. A year later, Shigeru Miyamoto announced that a new Fire Emblem title was in development for the system, aptly named Fire Emblem 64. However, the project was cancelled years later due to structural changes at Intelligence Systems and poor sales of the Nintendo 64 disk drive add-on. Internally, it was given the subtitle of Maiden of Darkness, the original subtitle given to Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. Interestingly, the work put into Fire Emblem 64 would serve as the basis for the Binding Blade years later on the Game Boy Advance. Most of the characters and story did not carry over, However, the main character Roy did. Originally, Roy was given the name Ike, a name that would be given to a different protagonist in a future sequel. In 1998, development of the last Super Famicom Fire Emblem title began. It was initially meant to be a small side story set between the two acts of Genealogy of the Holy War. However, the scope grew and pushed the release back far beyond what was originally intended. This would also serve as the final Fire Emblem title that Kaga would work on before leaving Intelligent Systems. Fire Emblem Thracia 776 was first released in Japan for the Nintendo Power Flash cartridge on September 1st, 1999. This was a Japan-only peripheral that allowed users to download Super Famicom and Game Boy games at a lower price point than a typical cartridge. Thracia 776 would later release on the Nintendo Super Famicom on January 21st, 2000. Kaga and Tsuchiyoko returned to their respective roles, with Takahiro Izushi producing and Mayumi Hirota returning from Genealogy of the Holy War as character designer. Thracia 776 takes place during Act 2 of Genealogy of the Holy War, and follows the plight of Leif, heir to the Republic of Manster. Leif had been on the run most of his life, but after seeing a village get decimated and his friends captured, he decides to fight back against the Kingdom of Thracia. Aided by his friend Finn, Leif amasses a loyal group of rebels, pushes out the forces of Thracia, and restores peace to his land. In terms of gameplay, Thracia 776 evolved the least compared to its predecessors. The tactical combat remained familiar, however victory conditions expanded beyond defeating enemies to objectives like rescuing certain units or escaping a map unharmed. One new mechanic was a Fog of War, where players could not see certain sections of the map until their units were within range. There was also a fatigue mechanic, where characters would lose stamina for various actions like attacking or opening chests. If a character became too fatigued, they would not be available for the next chapter. All these mechanics combined to make the game brutally difficult, with Thracia 776 widely considered to be the hardest game in the series. Despite receiving positive reviews, Thracia 776 was not a big seller. Estimates given have the sales somewhere between 106,000 and 145,000, making it the lowest selling entry in the franchise thus far. One major factor was Nintendo's big competition, the PlayStation. By the time Thracia 776 released for the Super Famicom, the PlayStation had already been out for over 5 years in Japan. The PlayStation quickly became home to some of the greatest RPGs of all time, and players had long since moved on. The years following the release of Thracia 776 would prove to be quite turbulent, not only for Intelligent Systems, but the series as a whole. Series creator Shozo Kaga would leave Intelligent Systems in 1999, and in 2000 form his own studio, Tirnanog. Shortly after, he announced that the studio's first project, titled Emblem Saga, was in development for Nintendo's biggest rival, the Sony PlayStation. To the uninitiated, Emblem Saga seemed nearly indistinguishable from Fire Emblem, employing a similar tactical combat style and even using similar character designs from Mayumi Hirota. Kaga made no attempt to disguise its similarities to Fire Emblem, and Nintendo was not pleased. Nintendo would sue Tirnanog and its publishing partner Enterbrain a total of 3 times, going as high up as the Japanese Supreme Court, claiming this was an infringement on copyrights. In the end, Tirnanog was forced to change the game's name, eventually settling on Tearing Saga, and Enterbrain was ordered to pay Nintendo a fee of 76 million yen. In the end, Nintendo could not stop the game from releasing, and on May 21st, 2001, Tearing Saga hit store shelves in Japan. The game was considered a success, garnering a score of 32 out of 40 from Famitsu, and went on to sell over 340,000 copies. Much like past Fire Emblem titles, however, it never saw a release outside of Japan. Tirnanog would release a sequel in 2005 for the PlayStation 2 titled Tearing Saga Berwick Saga, but sales were not quite as high, and it was ultimately the last game for the series in the studio. Dealing with the departure of Kaga and canceling Fire Emblem 64 in 2000 left the Fire Emblem series in a fractured state. It wasn't clear which direction the series would go next, or even on what platform. Despite releasing highly acclaimed titles like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64, the Nintendo 64 was not the massive hit Nintendo was hoping it would be. The major culprit was the game cartridges, which were expensive to produce and ultimately led longtime development partners to flee to Sony's PlayStation. In the end, the PlayStation would outsell the Nintendo 64 over 3-1, but Nintendo had its sights set on its next handheld console, the Game Boy Advance. It touted technical power that exceeded the Super Famicom, and a wider array of colors than the Game Boy. Taking everything they learned up until this point and salvaging what they could from Fire Emblem 64, Intelligent Systems would release the next entry in the series on a portable system for the very first time. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade was released in Japan for the Game Boy Advance on March 29, 2002. Toru Narihiro was elevated to director for the project, with Takahiro Izushi and Yuka Sugioka returning for their normal duties and Eiji Kaneda designing the characters. Much like past Fire Emblem entries, the story deals with the return of an ancient evil and heroes from the past. The plot begins on the continent of Alib and follows the adventures of Roy, the son of Eliwood, who serves as the Marquis to the region of Foray. Eliwood fell ill, and it was up to Roy to lead an army to push back the invading forces. One of the central plot elements of the Binding Blade were the 8 divine weapons, legendary items used to banish dragons over 1,000 years ago. The titular Binding Blade was an even more powerful weapon that Roy discovers through the course of the story. The Fire Emblem also made a return that, when combined with the Binding Blade, gave Roy incredible power. The story of the Binding Blade was unique in that it had several branching points depending on the actions of the player. The game culminated with a battle against King Zephiel, the ruler of Bern. However, if the player had collected all 8 divine weapons through the course of the game continued beyond this point, and the true history of Alib would be revealed. Roy learned that the dragons of ancient times reproduced at a much slower rate than humans, and their numbers slowly dwindled. In a move of desperation, the dragons enslaved a divine dragon named Idun, who was able to reproduce dragons at a much faster rate. Having been sealed away for hundreds of years, Zephiel released Idun to wreak havoc on the world. Ultimately, Roy and his army were able to defeat Idun and restore peace to Alib. Through the story, Roy would meet a woman named Lilina from the region of Ostia. Lilina's father, Hector, was friends with Roy's father, Eliwood, and would play a prominent role in a future prequel. Gameplay for the Binding Blade remained largely unchanged from previous titles. Signature elements like the grid-based combat, permadeath, and the weapon triangle all made a return. The emphasis was clearly on polishing the systems created in past titles. The difficulty was also lowered to make it more approachable for players. The Binding Blade put the series back on track, selling over 100,000 copies in its first week, and going on to sell nearly 350,000 in total. It later released for Nintendo's Virtual Console on Wii U, but to this day still remains a Japan exclusive. After 6 releases over the course of 12 years, Fire Emblem had firmly established itself as a staple Nintendo franchise. The only problem is that the rest of the world had never heard of it. That is until Nintendo released its smash hit fighting game for the GameCube. Join us for part 2 of the Fire Emblem series retrospective, where we'll take a look at the franchise's first foray into the West, its eventual return to home consoles, and how the franchise was almost cancelled forever. We'll see you then.